Welcome to the Shared Practices Podcast. This is Season 2, Episode 9. I'm your host, Dr. Richard Lowe. I'm actually super excited this week. At the very beginning of the podcast, and I think I've mentioned it maybe once or twice before, I said that my wife ultimately owned the podcast, and that was for relationship with the Army and things like that. It was also for her ability to pull the plug if my residency plus the podcast got to be too much. And we kind of reached a breaking point, unfortunately, this last week. And she said, we need to change something. So I've been thinking long and hard about what do I do? You know, I love this podcast. I would hate to kill the momentum. And our plan was to finish this season out and then take a break for the last year of the residency and maybe in some format have an episode here or there. But for the most part, put it to rest. And that was killing me. That was really something I was not looking forward to doing. Fortunately, I shared this with some of my friends, and one of them being George Hariri, who I've mentioned on the podcast several times, and he contributed some things in the last season, and we've been meaning to do an interview anyways. And he said, well, we could maybe do something together. I was like, yeah, maybe we could co-host, and even you could take over for a whole season. Let's try this out. So I'm excited today to bring on George Hariri, and I'll have him introduce himself here in a minute, but we're going to go over a ton of really good information about demographics and some other things. Don't feel like you need to take notes because he's got set aside all of this in like a presentation. We're going to have a link to it. You're going to be able to download that really easily after the show. We're going to try and do that more often from now on because we've hit some really dense content, and we don't want you to feel like you have to go back and listen to it again and take notes. I mean, if you want to listen to it again, that's fine. But podcasts aren't great for transferring that kind of information. And so we want to make that easier for you. So from now on, subscribe on the website, and we're going to start using our email list to give out more detailed info and have links and PDFs and downloads more often from shows. So without going on too much more, I'm going to welcome on George Hariri. Welcome to the show.
Thanks, Richard. It's great to be here. I'm excited about what you're doing with Shared Practices, and talking to you and really hearing your vision for what you plan on doing moving forward made me really excited and wanted to be a part of it. So I'm super excited.
This is going to be fun. This is going to be really good. It's kind of been a lonely affair of me talking into a mic and doing all the editing and everything on the back end. So it's like 5 days into this that we've been kind of working together and playing with this idea. And it's already a lot of ideas and synergy have already occurred. So this is going to be good. So let's start with your background.
Absolutely. My wife and I we went to undergrad together at the University of Arizona down in Tucson. And we kind of blazed through it 3 years, and we were done. We got our degrees, and we kind of came up here to Phoenix at Midwestern University. Okay. And we're actually both D3s now. We're about to start our D4 year here in June. So we got about a year left, and then our plans are to stay in Phoenix and hopefully buy a practice. And I'll get into that kind of later in the show.
So when did you guys meet officially? Did you met in undergrad, and when did you get married?
We met in high school.
High school, okay.
So she is my high school sweetheart.
Nice.
We met our junior year of high school in physics, and then we got married after college before dental school.
And who decided on dentistry first? Was it you or her?
My mom's a dentist, so I definitely would think it's probably me. Okay. But we were both in med school, dental school, kind of. Yeah,
the pre-med, pre-dental.
Exactly.
Hitting all those core. And then was it your mom who ultimately convinced her, or, what were her influences to decide on dentistry?
I really don't want to say that it was my mom saying that, but I have to think that my mom being a dentist had something to do with it. But ultimately, I think it was
her choice. Yeah, no, for sure. Okay, cool. Well, so you didn't go too far from Tucson up to Phoenix to Midwestern. And I first got introduced to you through Derek Williams. And he created a dentaltown group on dentaltown for ambitious dental students. And you must have stumbled across this like freshman year of dental school. How
it was winter of my D1 year.
Okay. So were you already on Dentaltown at that point? And how did you like get connected with Derek? What's the story there?
So let me kind of start at the beginning of D1. I think it might make more sense. Kind of starting dental school, I didn't really have any business background at all.
Okay.
And I think maybe it was you brought Howard Ferran up to our school and brought us all Chipotle, and we ate with him, and then we listened to a talk. And so that was my first time really listening to anybody about dental business. It was kind of right when my D1 year started. My wife and I were kind of reassessing our goals and what we wanted to accomplish in dental school. And we kind of realized we both wanted to be GPs. And Howard said something in that talk that I never will forget, and it kind of changed the way I looked at things. And he said, "What do you call a dentist who does one or two things right?" And he said, "A millionaire." And I thought, I'm like, well, okay, that's interesting. What if you do everything right? And so then I kind of, at the same time, was reading Rich Dad, Poor Dad for the very first time.
Nice.
And I think the combination of those two things completely changed my focus to completely dedicate myself to learning about the business side of dentistry and just business in general, really. And it's kind of become a passion of mine. And so I just always be looking on Dentaltown, and I saw Derek posting a thread about Breakaway.
Okay.
And he posted about wanting to go to Breakaway. And I was wanting to go to Breakaway too. So I emailed him and I asked him, so what do you think about Breakaway? Have you gone yet? At the time, I didn't know that you could read the date of the thread on Dentaltown, so it was like fresh, but I thought it was really old. So I emailed him, and then he told me about the group, and he invited me to the group. And then actually on a podcast later, Sandy Pardue mentions that there's a dental student writing a thread about wanting to go to a seminar, and she was talking about Derek. So it's kind of, it was a big thread at the time. Everyone was telling him not to do it.
Yeah.
And so I met Derek that way, and then he introduced me to the Ambitious Dental Students group, and then I kind of started contributing on there a lot. And then in my second year, he founded the group, and then he kind of brought me on as a co-admin.
Did you actually go to Breakaway with Derek then?
I did. After our D1 year, we went to Breakaway together.
Was that the special week-long thing that Abhinav went to and a few other people?
Absolutely. It was the week-long with Scott Luna. I only got to go. My wife and I couldn't make the whole thing. So we flew in a couple days before the seminar. So we had a couple days in their support center and then the entire seminar.
Oh, I'm so jealous. I was right up the road from you guys when all that was happening, but I was still new enough in the Army that I didn't have enough leave, and I didn't know how taking leave worked and all this stuff. So and it also felt like, oh, well, this wouldn't make sense for me to go now because I'm not getting out for 6 years. In retrospect, I'm such an idiot. I should have gone, but I was jealous because Abe came up to Austin afterwards and told me all about it, and I was like, okay, I'm an idiot. So
Abe is not one to make things sound less spectacular than they are.
That's awesome. So that's usually how his endos are too. So now you're plugged into this Ambitious Dental Students. The thing that was crazy about that group on Dentaltown was that Derek created this group, and he was bringing Scott Luna and Graham Dursley and other people to the group, and they were posting on the group for this private group of Ambitious Dental Students. So there was something special about it, and you could just tell everyone who was in there was trying to contribute. And I was at that time I was working for Howard at Dentaltown producing his podcast. So I actually didn't contribute a lot because I was doing work for Dentaltown. And so getting on Dentaltown now felt like work. It wasn't as fun as it used to be once I was actually running his podcast. So you guys put up some amazing threads. Kid Esperanto, Hunter Smith, all these people got on there and just answered your questions and laid things out. And you guys started to accumulate some amazing content just on that private Facebook or Dentaltown group. So that was really cool to see all that happen.
Yeah, it's definitely my favorite place to post on Dentaltown is that private group. And Hunter Smith, that thread is still going, and that is definitely one of the best threads on there.
Yeah. Well, okay, so you then put together this spreadsheet that we used last season, and we're going to use moving forward for valuing practices. And basically to kind of remedy this issue of you get all this data back from someone a broker or a practice you're interested in, and you're like, well, what do I do with this? And it's hard because every single time it's in a different format, and some data is included and other data is not. So where was the origin of this spreadsheet, and how did you actually make it?
So that was really during my second year of dental school where Hunter Smith started that thread, and he started kind of going through his formula of talking about practice valuations that you guys went over last episode.
Yeah.
And I went through and I kind of just made a spreadsheet. I actually took a course in college about Excel. So
that's how we know you're a super nerd.
There's a story to it, but I'm not going to get into it. It was so I took the course on Excel, and I made the spreadsheet, and it was just an easier way for me because everyone was posting all these practices. It was so easy for me to just plug in the metrics, and then it kind of spits out evaluation. And now I've kind of taken it and I've gone, since I posted that spreadsheet, even it just made projections, and there's so many things you can build off of it, and it's so much fun to put practice data into and get back valuable information on how that practice is going to do or how it's not going to do.
Well, and one of the biggest things is like to be able to digest that much information, you can't take it all in at once. You need to focus on a few key things. And so the way you laid it out and the things that it outputs focus you on like the doctor to hygiene ratio. And I can't remember what are some of the other things that we talk about, like the productivity or the profitability of the practice overall. What were some of the main things that you liked to look at from that spreadsheet?
I like to look at the hygiene ratio. I like to look at the EBITDA, which Hunter talks about last episode as the profitability of the practice.
Right.
And then I also really like to look at the cash flow of the practice after debt service.
Okay.
So I like to look at how much the owner actually takes home having bought the practice for the purchase price.
Interesting. Because the funny thing is that's not the number that we focus on for valuation. That's like a after valuation, how much can you actually live on, which when it comes down to it, like that's really the number that is going to matter to you, because that's so in theory, if everything goes as planned, that's how much money you're going to make. So that's great that you kind of have it all broken down, and that includes like the loan. Do you put in the interest rate as well? And so then it calculates like the interest rate and the loan and the terms, or are you just estimating the payment on the practice?
Correct. It's a purchase price, term of the loan, how many years, and then the rate. And I assume fixed rate because I don't want to get into the variable rate.
Sure. So it's a ballpark figure, but it gets you a whole lot closer than just like, okay, I'm going to buy this practice for $1 million, and I don't know when I subtract out my loan payment how much money I'm going to have left over, and if I'm going to be able to do this, that, and the other. So it's super useful.
Exactly.
Well, okay. From there, you've done the ambitious dental student thing. You were going to, for a little while, do a startup was kind of your plan. So why were you going to do a startup? Why was that your like default?
I think most people that go to Breakaway leave with the plan of doing a startup, I would have to guess. It's kind of the route that seems the most predictable at the time. And it was kind of back maybe a couple years ago before Hunter Smith really came on the scene. It was kind of the way to go. Everyone was really doing de novo startups. And at the time, Todd Peterson did his startup. Okay. And I think it was his startup that kind of made me realize that for a new grad, it isn't really the best route to go into if you want immediate practice ownership. And I think there's so many things about a startup that require patience, really. And I just don't have that kind of patience to do that whole process and then be left with a practice with no patience. While it has a lot of growth potential, it's just not my style.
So what about his practice and his startup made you realize that? Like, what was it? What were the things that he was having to be patient about in his startup?
Sure. I think first, if you kind of start by a little bit about myself, my wife and I are we have parameters in which we choose to live our life. Like, for example, we want to stay in Phoenix after we graduate. Okay. So we're kind of ruling out all other possibilities. So another thing is we really like the part of Phoenix we're in. And so kind of watching, I am a little bit. But Todd Peterson, he went through his practice and he kind of had the perfect situation. It couldn't have gone better for him in terms of a student doing a startup. A lot of things, he really worked really hard to make them go his way. And then he had complications later. But he was in a town that pretty much was really a lot of opportunity. There was only one other small dentist and I think like 10 to 15,000 people.
Oh, wow.
High income town. He's from that town. He knew the guy, the landlord and him had some sort of special relationship, which made it easier. Nice. But then also with the startup, there's such a capital intensive period where you don't have your loan yet. And it requires you to put significant upfront capital to get to the point of even receiving your loan for the build out. So part of that process requires you to have a significant amount saved up. And I think for a student graduating, wanting to get into ownership with a non-cash flowing business coming out of school, it just didn't seem like a good fit for me.
Okay. No, and that makes so much sense because that hungry period where things are getting delayed because, some permit didn't get approved or the building's not up to code because your, guy didn't install the right piping or something like that. Delays are happening. You don't have any patients. You're not having any income come in. And then eventually the practice finally starts up and then you've got maybe a slower patient flow and it slowly builds. I mean, there can be 6 months or longer where you're in limbo, not because of your fault or anyone's fault in particular, but it just happens that way. Life happens when you're doing a startup and doing a complicated business transaction like this. So having a reserve is prudent, and you don't have that right now. We coming out of dental school, you have the opposite. You have a big student loan payment, and you want to start paying towards that. You want to start saving. You want to start doing all these other things. So that's awesome that you were able to kind of realize from his experience, you know what, even in an ideal scenario, it's still not going to go perfectly. So maybe we should look at acquisition. So you kind of shifted your mindset at that point. When was that? How recently was that?
Towards the beginning of my second year, I would say. Because he opened his startup October of after he graduated. I think I was a second year student. I kind of saw it.
Okay.
And so the thing is with the startup, you graduate and then you get your license and then you apply for the loan, you get the loan, and then you can start construction. So you're kind of looking at 5 months after graduation before best case scenario, you open doors.
Right.
So just for a new grad, that wasn't really what I wanted. Maybe down the road, that's something I do, but I think initially it's just I know where I'm going now, and I'm happier with the acquisition route.
I'm going to be telling a few stories of dentists who've used the Form 2 to transform their offices, to start side businesses, to supplement their ability to educate and help others. And we're starting with my buddy, Dr. Paul Johnson. Paul introduced me to the Form 2 and actually is the one who printed my first surgical case for me. So here's Dr. Paul Johnson on his experience with 3D printing his own Loops light in dental school.
The original idea behind it was that I was frustrated for my classmates. I was frustrated myself with the expense that we had to incur on ourselves for, $1,000 for a light. And my thought was, well, I could run to Radio Shack and totally put together my own light. I could put my LED here and I could make a driver. I could make a battery pack. And
sure,
I did that in about a night. I talked to my dad, who's a dentist, and I said, look, I think the hardest part to overcome right now is how do I prototype these different little design iterations to confirm that they'd work?
Yeah.
My dad kept saying, you need to buy a 3D printer. You need to buy a 3D printer.
Huh.
And at the time, 3D printing was just kind of becoming more of a consumer level product. And he said, no, this is worth it. This is going to be a business, and learned and designed my first parts and put it into the printer. And there's definitely a learning curve on those earlier printers where they're FDM and they lay down hot plastic, and they're not very user friendly. There's definitely a learning curve on them. But I started a little light company for about 7 years, and it sold really well, and we had some minor success, and every light had a few 3D printed parts incorporated into them.
This was just the beginning of Paul's journey, but if you want to have a 3D printer that doesn't have a learning curve, you should get the Form 2. When I plugged it in this last week, and there's literally a button called one-click print. It orients the model, builds supports, sends it to the printer, and it prints. We have a little mini baby Groot that my daughter proceeded to take to school and got confiscated because she's not supposed to have toys at school. So if you want to invent a dental product or start a side business, or maybe just print your own surgical guides as easy as one click, go to formlabs.com/shared practices and request a free sample. Okay, so then you guys decided on acquisitions. So then I think that's kind of when you started getting into the valuing of practices and the spreadsheet and all of that. So how did you go about looking for an acquisition in a crowded market like Phoenix? Like, what was your plan and your strategy and your thought for, and not only do you have to find a practice, you have to find a practice that's going to support you and your wife, preferably. So how did that go?
So now you've brought me to about midway through my second year where I kind of realized I kind of made a list of all of the things I wanted in a practice. And this was based on Hunter's thread and kind of on Hunter's podcast that you listen to. You kind of get the same thing. We wanted it to have good demographic opportunity for growth because we knew that we would need external growth to reach the size that we wanted. We wanted at least 6 operatories in the office,
Okay.
preferably more than 7. We wanted a high hygiene percentage. We wanted doctors who referred out procedures that we could add on. And then we wanted preferably a high EBITDA margin, which Hunter talks about last time. And then we also just want a doctor who's willing to stay on and kind of go through a transition with us, a reverse associateship, so to speak. It's a wish list. And it's kind of that practice that you guys were describing last episode, the diamond in the rough practice.
Yeah.
And I kind of figured out, again, in my second year, that I don't think I'm going to find this practice for the broker. Because as a student, I kind of watched this because Derek went through the process. And then a lot of other students kind of emailing me offices that the brokers give them. They kind of give them the offices that nobody else really wants and are under the $325,000 amount that students can loan. So the office I described definitely does not sell for $325,000. Definitely not in Phoenix. So that's where I really determined that I needed to find a way to find a diamond in the rough practice. And that's where I kind of delved into demographics. And I feel like the demographics was my answer to that question.
Okay. So how can demographics make a so-so or a decent practice significantly better?
It can do that just by offering the opportunity of external growth. But really what I was more interested in was finding a practice that had internal and external growth. And so I still think the answer is through demographics, because if you really assume that all practices are in a plateau where just kind of been going the same way, not much growth over a number of years, you'll kind of realize that patients in equals patients out.
Okay.
So when you figure that out, the practices with the most new patient flow are likely having the highest hygiene percentage and likely offer doctors the opportunity to refer the most procedures since they have an abundance of patients. And in addition to that, it also has the opportunity for external growth. So I kind of did a theory in my head where I looked at how could I find the practice I'm looking for without even looking at the financials.
Huh. Okay. So what's the method?
So the method is if you find a way to evaluate offices in a way to predict their new patient flow, then doing a formula ranking these offices in order of what you would predict the most new patient flow would be the highest likelihood that you find an office that looks good on paper, has a high EBITDA margin, high hygiene percentage, and would be the doctors most likely to be referring procedures. Okay.
So how do you know if these practices are likely to have a high new patient flow?
That's where the demographics come in. I looked at the various demographics that I'll go over in a minute, and then I also looked at their visibility. So I went to all of the offices that I was ranking. I looked at their visibility, and then I just kind of created a ranking algorithm by myself. I don't know if it's right or not, but I ranked them, and then I used that information, and I contacted an office, and I have one aligned right now. I can't say too much about it, but I will talk about the demographics. So I'm going to kind of go over some key demographics that allowed me to make this kind of ranking algorithm and then go through the process.
Okay. So you've got, and like you said, you can't say too much about it, but you've got a practice that you are likely going to purchase upon graduation, correct?
Correct.
And it's lined up with everything that you've set up for yourself, both in terms of the actual finances and the demographics and the new patient flow. So what are the key factors of that you just talked about?
So the key demographic factors you're asking?
Mm-hmm.
So I think first, before we talk about demographics, you and Hunter were kind of talking about target patients a little bit. And I just wanted to find a target patient. Is in my case, kind of the PPO office is typically a patient with an income of about $50,000 a year or more, kind of a household income. So and
how did you arrive at that? Like where are you pulling that number from in terms of just like it makes sense, or have you heard this from someone else? Like where does this 50,000 come from?
It's just kind of a standard that people talk about. I think Dentographics is where I get a lot of my information from.
Okay.
And so I use their dental office to target population ratio, where other people use a dentist to population ratio.
Dentist office. So say that again. A
dental office to target population ratio. So instead of looking at dentist to population, because what if you have an office with 3 dentists?
Yeah, no, that's always been one of my questions.
3 times, but in reality, it's as much competition as another office with only 1 dentist in terms of its visibility, and it only has 1 phone number, only has 1 location. So I think, and Dentographics feels it should only be counted once.
Huh. So it's almost like the physical location, the visibility, and the marketing are the bottleneck for those dentists. So, and we're assuming that they're not being perfect with all of that. And so it's one location competing against another location versus one location competing with three locations.
Exactly.
Huh. That's awesome. I've never heard that before. So, okay. So dentist office to population ratio. So that's what your kind of foundation metric that you're looking at.
Yeah, your dental office to target population ratio. And so when you look at a ratio, I have a link in that presentation. And when you go to that link, you can see the income distribution of the population in that area in a radius around the office. And I'll talk about how to find that radius in a bit. But that radius, obviously, the higher the median income, the larger percent of the population is above $50,000 of median household income.
Okay. So you're not just looking at, dentist office to population. You're targeting these above 50,000. You're using the average median, the median income, the average, to just guesstimate and assume that, okay, there's going to be people who are doing a little bit better over here. So that is my target population. And there's not as many dentists for that concentration. How do you like turn it into numbers? So give me an example of what a median income would be for an area, and then like how you estimate the actual amount above 50,000.
Sure. So actually on that tool, it's like a Missouri demographics report, census data tool that you put in latitude and longitude for a specific location, and then you'll get population outputs and the distribution of their income. So you don't really have to guess. You'll see hard numbers on how many of the folks in that area have income of certain ranges. But What I was saying about median income is, if you think about an area with a median income of 55,000, you could assume that a good portion of that population is above 55,000 and also a good portion is below 55,000.
Sure.
But if you look at an area with, like the area I'm looking at is 102,000 is the median income. A much smaller percentage of that population is going to be not target patients because, just the median income is much higher. So that's really where median income comes in, is what percentage of your population are going to be target patients versus non-target patients.
Huh. So you've got median income as a good estimator, and then you've got this more advanced tool that does give you specific. But yeah, if you just are far enough in the right direction, then you can just assume that you don't have a bunch of 200,000 income and welfare people on the other end to skew it back to 100,000. You would assume that standard distribution bell curve around the 100,000.
Exactly.
Okay. So I'm just trying to think of like, okay, this is a lot of like data. It's a little bit more complex than people are typically trying to think about this. How did you like map this out? Did you like print off, was this conspiracy theory where you've got like a map and a bunch of dental offices pinned on the wall and like you're drawing on it, or how were you keeping track of all of this and figuring this out?
So in the presentation, I hate to keep referring to it, but in that presentation, I showed that I have screenshots of kind of how I do it.
Okay.
And I use a program called Google My Maps.
Yeah, I've heard of that.
Like
Okay.
Google Maps, but you can pin specific locations, and then I put that on Google Earth and I draw the circles and I count the dentists, and it's actually not that complicated.
The person that I heard that from was another interview that I just did recently with Tuan Pham. So we'll hear his use of Google My Maps on a different episode. But okay, so you can save your map with the dental offices that you've got pinned in there.
Yeah, you should see my map for Phoenix. I think it has over like 1,500 dentists all over the valley. I've been at that thing for a long time. So it's definitely a big asset for me now because I can look at a single office and know the ratios very quickly because I have all that information stored.
So you've physically gone in and added each one of these to your little Google My Map.
Yep.
Do you add any practice data about that? Or is it just like one location, here it is, pin?
I used to add how many doctors are in the location. I used to color code them, but I stopped doing that because I started going with the dental office to population ratio. So that kind of dropped out. I do want to talk about, though, the population density, because that's another metric I like to look at, because when you think about it, there's a lot more value in being a population dense area versus an area with 3,000 people and you're the only dentist versus an area with 42,000 people and there's 12 or 13 dentists. It's the same ratio, but in one, you have another dentist coming in and then it's 1,500 to 1, and the other one, another dentist can come in and the ratio is unaffected.
Right. Okay. That makes sense. So how quickly new competition would adversely affect you. And on the other end, Hunter and I kind of talked about this idea of how ramping up your marketing can draw in. I like to think of it like suction. If you were to suck in through a funnel, you could pull in more patients from this whole wider area, versus kind of if you didn't have a really strong force pulling that in. I don't know if that's like a weird, creepy analogy, but that's kind of
the way
what
I like to
of.
think about it is if the population is more dense, there's more people in that specific area, then there's just more new patients to be had every month.
Sure.
So if you outcompete your competition, you'll get more new patients than if there are only 3,000 people in the area.
Okay. So these three, is there any other like key foundational metrics that you like to look at?
Yes, I like to look at median income. I already talked about that briefly. Median age. And then you can use those two to calculate. Dentographics calculates dental expenditures per capita. I don't know how to calculate that one. I get that one from the reports.
So, and you've mentioned Dentographics multiple times. Where did you learn about them, and what is their service, and how do you recommend people use them?
Sure. Breakaway recommends them. So I went to Breakaway and I heard about them. And then I did a single site study in my second year of dental school, and I looked at a specific site. And then I used them for an area analysis report where I looked at an area of about maybe 2 million people. I looked at a kind of a big area, and that let me know where in that area should I spend my time looking at specific offices and where I should not, because there's no opportunity.
Okay, cool. So you didn't have to run like a ton of reports through them because you knew pretty specifically the side of the valley and where you guys wanted to be. So that initial report gave you a ton of data. Is it like a couple $100, like $200, $300, $400, $500? Do you remember how much it costs?
I think their single site study is running for $349, and I think their area analysis is $599. I'm not totally sure on those numbers.
Okay, somewhere in that range though. So if you didn't know a specific area that you wanted to go and you were looking at practices across multiple states, like maybe Derek Williams was looking at, it might not be prudent to pull these reports up front. But if you're kind of honed in on this is where we want to live, I need to know, and I would assume when you have a large metro, getting the densities and all these different things is a little bit more valuable than if it's a smaller area.
Absolutely. Because within that metro, people say Phoenix is saturated, and that's just a complete misnomer because Phoenix is composed of 100 dental markets that are each, 2 miles in radius. So you would have to look at every single 2-mile radius and look at all of their demographics, and then you'll see whether or not it's saturated or not. And what you'll find is that in most metro areas, there's opportunities within these areas that people just don't go to. Usually it's because of a lack of commercial real estate, but not always. There'll just be areas that are more open and pockets of opportunity, they call them. And that way you can go in there and then you can have favorable demographics while living in a metro area that you want to live in.
Huh. That's awesome. Is that a Breakaway concept, or is that something that you kind of found somewhere else?
That is a Breakaway concept.
Okay, cool. People just go take Breakaway. I'm still jealous that I still haven't taken it, as you already know. Okay, so now you've got the median age. What was the other one you just said?
Median income and then dental expenditures per capita.
Dental expenditures per capita. So break that down for someone who it's just like per person, how much they're willing to spend on dentistry.
Correct. It's kind of positively correlated with both median income and median age, where the older somebody is and the more money they have, kind of both of those factors drive up their dental spending per year.
Okay.
So it's just kind of a metric. Area I'm looking at, it's like 140 per capita per year. So I don't know what that means relatively, but that was the number. Okay.
Interesting. So, and I guess you can use that to then multiply, by your patient base, or, what would you use that number for?
It's more valuable when you're looking at two specific areas in the same area analysis report.
Okay.
That are close. It's a good deciding factor because in this area, your patients will spend more. So you're, the same number of patients, you may have more revenue. It's kind of like a tiebreaker at the end. I look more at the dental office, the target population ratio and the population density than anything else.
And I'm trying to think of, where would a case be where that would be the tiebreaker? And maybe, because you said it correlates with age. So maybe you've got two populations that are making about the same amount of money. They're about the same density, but one is overall younger. The other one's older. the younger kids may be taking care of their teeth better. They haven't had problems. And so they're just going to be spending less on dentistry by virtue of need. Whereas the older ones would be maybe a little bit better patients for you.
Yeah. And, the range was quite big. It was, from about $110, maybe $190 in some poor areas to about like $170, $180 plus in the wealthy part of Sun City retirement community. So I think it was actually a valuable information to have, and, kind of picking somewhere that fits your, desire, what population you really want to serve.
Well, and it sounds like, some of those patients, you don't want to say this, but it seems like they're worth almost 2 times as much, 1.8 times as much as a patient from the other side of the valley, because they're just going to spend more money in your practice. So
absolutely.
Your advertising, your new patient numbers, all of those like get a little bonus added in from the start. So that's good to know walking into that. Okay, cool. So you've got all this data. You've accumulated a lot of it yourself. You've compiled it. You've got your maps. Now, how, for someone doing a startup, that's one thing. How do you then kind of merge this with the acquisition piece?
Perfect. I'm glad you said that. So for an acquisition, you kind of find, unless you're going to do what I did, which I think is a little bit over the top and you have a lot of time, you really just start finding practices. Yeah. And then you just start using this information to calculate the competition in the area. And you look at kind of a radius of about 30,000 people around the office, however far that is from the office. Usually it's in Phoenix, it's 2 miles, in an area with less population density, it might be 3, 5. But you look at what are the 30,000 people immediately around the office, and then you calculate those metrics I talked about, and then you kind of have an idea of what the demographics are for that specific location. Okay.
So, if someone's not going to spend all that time up front, it's just office by office. Let's break that down. Okay. So I get the numbers from a broker, and I'm like, okay, I'm going to run my version of the demographics on it first. So I would pull it up. I would make a little Google My Maps that would create a 30,000-ish people circle around this, assuming we're in a metro. And then I would plot all of the dental offices in that area. And then I would look at what is the median income and, what are the ranges. So now I know, okay, of this 30,000, what percentage of this population is actually the patients that I care about. So now we've got a office to target population ratio, and we can compare that to maybe another location or just to kind of the baseline that we have. And now I'm trying to think, what else would you tie in here? What would be your next step? Have I gotten it right up to this point? What would you change?
You're good. You calculate the number of offices, like you said, and then you look at how many target patients are in that. You look at 30,000 patients around the office, and then you calculate how many target patients. And then you just look for, last thing is maybe natural barriers, like a freeway or like a river with a bridge or something like that. People typically don't cross a freeway to go to the dentist, and people typically don't go across a bridge to go to the dentist. Okay. So it's kind of nice for you if you're in an area where there's more dentists and more commercial real estate on one side of the freeway than another. It can serve as a natural barrier from a competitive area.
Huh. Okay. So you would then maybe recommend driving the area and just kind of checking it out yourself? Or
Absolutely.
Okay. What are you looking for when you do that?
I'm looking for curb appeal. I'm looking for availability of commercial real estate. And I'm looking for, if it's a residential area, if it's a highly commercial area. I'd prefer a highly residential area because of a barrier to entry for competition in terms of the lack of commercial real estate.
Okay, so if you can get in there and you're looking at acquisitions, you don't have to get new real estate. They already have that spot. So now you can get in there, and it's less likely that some new dentist is going to come along and plop down next to you.
Exactly. And I want to make a point, though. This is mainly important for individuals who are looking to buy an office and plan to grow it more than 30%. I think 30% is kind of the number I go with. So I think internal growth can go up to 30%. But if you're buying an office that is kind of a fixer-upper, so to speak, or you want to double the revenue to reach your ideal practice size, then this is where this is really important. It'll make that growth a lot easier having an area with solid demographics versus an area where you're going to be kind of fighting very hard and your cost per new patient is going to be very high, and it's going to be a lot longer of a road to get to your ideal practice size.
Okay, so this is kind of the immediate opportunity for external growth and also internal growth potentially through the demographics. So you're still going to do all the financial analysis, but you're saying you did this almost before you had the finances for these practices, or how did you do this?
Yeah, it's funny. I contacted a broker my winter of my D1 year. I contacted a broker and I said, I'm graduating in 3.5 years and I'd like to find a practice. And she told me, well, I can't show you any practices because you can't buy any of them. So I said, okay. And then I was kind of seeing people go through this process and I thought, you know what? I'm looking for something very specific. And of the 20 to 50, whatever practices are available in Phoenix, I don't think I'm going to find it. I don't think a broker is going to show it to me. So then I decided to go this demographic route to find an office that met all of what I was looking for based on my theory that new patients in would lead to high hygiene and high EBITDA margin and all of those things I was looking for.
Huh. So then what was the plan? So you find this ideal office, reach out to them and see if they're willing to sell?
So I found 11. I found 11 practices, and that was my list. I did my area analysis report, and then I looked in all of the areas that were above 2,000 to 1. My dental office to population ratio was 2,000 to 1. I found all the offices, and I kind of separated them in two groups. So you kind of have your 40-year-old to 50-year-old doctor, 40 to 55. And that was a doctor that I felt like would only sell if they were burnt out. I didn't feel like they would retire at that age. So I just had them on a list with their name and address, and I kind of kept it in my back pocket as a plan B because they're not really a candidate for a senior associate who would stay on with me. They were more a candidate for someone where I would just buy their practice, they would leave, I would take over, and it would be a done transaction. So that was kind of my plan B, and I had about 160 offices lined up for that route in the whole valley. And then my second...
So there was 160 of those, and then 11 of this second group. Is that what you're saying? 11
of the second group. I was less picky about the demographics in that group because I felt like I just needed a volume of people to send letters to.
Okay.
And then the second group, I had 55 and up in areas of strong demographics, and I have the demographics here. The dental office to population ratio ranged from about 2,700 to 1 all the way up to 6,200 to 1, and the average was kind of around 4,000 to 1 for those 11 offices.
Okay, wow.
And this is in Phoenix, where everyone says it's saturated. So, I'm not lying.
Huh.
And then I went to all these offices. My wife and we went to all these offices, and we ranked their visibility. And I have a rubric. I include it in the presentation of how I rank these offices. I gave them a raw score. And then I compiled all the information that Dentographics uses that I mentioned above. Those are all the metrics I used. And I compiled them, and then I just did a little formula. I normalized them and just kind of math geeky things. And then I spit out 1 through 11, what were the offices and in what order did I expect them to get new patients better than, I guess, each other. I kind of put them against each other. And so I had a list 1 through 11.
What was the average age of the dentists at these offices? I mean, and how did you find the age of the dentists at these offices? For someone who's like, how do you even know that? Where do you find that information?
That's a great question. I went to their website and I found their year of graduation, and I assumed they all graduated at 26 years old. That was kind of the best I could do.
Okay. So it's not perfect, but it's not going to assume the wrong direction. Very few would be graduating sooner than that.
Yeah, I think youngest was 55, oldest 68.
Okay.
And I think average was maybe early 60s, high 50s, but it's only 11, so So
now you have this like creepily amazing list of practices that you're like, these guys are my practices. I could grow these. They should be thinking about retiring. How do you approach these offices and these doctors and try and buy them out? Like what's the next step for you?
Sure. From that list, I determined which one I wanted the most. And I called that office and I told them that, my wife and I are interested in practicing together and we wanted some advice.
Huh.
And so then I didn't get a call back. I called 5 times before I got a call back. And on the 5th time, I got a call back. And we kind of started talking, and then the doctor asked me what I was planning on doing after school, and I told the doctor I'd like to buy an office. And then the doctor said, well, I'd like to sell in the next 12 to 18 months-ish. So I said, well, that kind of lines up because I'm graduating in 18 months. By the time I got a hold of them, it was now like January of this year, so pretty recent. And so then from there, that conversation began, and currently we have a handshake deal in place to buy the office. I submitted an LOI, and there weren't really issues with the LOI itself. It's just they can't really sign an LOI at this point just because it's a little far out for them to sign a binding agreement on their office. But they said they wouldn't look, and I said I wouldn't look, which kind of pains me, not to look.
Yeah.
But I'm not looking, and we really like them and everything. So
this was your number one.
Correct. That's the one I wanted the most. And I think there's a point that I'm maybe not making yet, but I want to right now, is that the only reason I knew to call them 5 times as opposed to sending them a letter that they would throw away is because I did all of this work up front and I saw the value in the location, the demographics, the opportunity. And then when I saw the financials and all the production reports of the practice, I saw that it met all of my criteria before I even had a hold of it. I didn't have that information ahead of time. I just kind of guessed. And I mean, I'm 1 for 1, I guess. I haven't looked at 2 through 11, but I think it worked out in my favor doing it that way because now I have an opportunity I would have never had otherwise.
My mind is blown right now. Like this is phenomenal. That's just so awesome. Like you like, it's like calculating the odds at something in Vegas and you found the table and the rolls and it's just going to work. And it worked. And you reached out to this guy and he's like, well, yeah, no, I want to sell my practice. What do you want to do when you graduate? And like, well, I'd like to maybe buy your exact office.
I actually told him that. We had dinner and, I told him, I really want your office and I'm paying them a great price for it. But I'm getting what I feel is a great office. And it's an ideal scenario. And so for me, it's totally worth it.
Did you tell him like the calculations that went into this? No,
I just told him I really love the location and it's a great opportunity. And, they said some things too. They're like, everyone's struggling for a new patient. We don't seem to have a problem. They said something like that. And I'm like laughing to myself like, yeah, why?
Wow. That's awesome. Like, that I had no clue that this is where this was going to go. So, and do you think it currently could support both you and your wife? Like that, because that was another factor for you was that you needed a practice where you could have 2 docs. And I don't know, how much you're planning on you working and her working 5 days or 4 days or 3 days. What were you looking for in terms of that for you and your wife?
Yeah, again, we were looking for an office that could, and again, it's specific. We could look for an office that supported me, my wife, and a senior associate, and we found it.
That's awesome. This is really cool. How replicatable do you feel like this is? Have you talked with anyone and kind of, you said you have a presentation. Have you given this presentation to anyone?
Not really. I don't think anybody would put in that kind of work to find that out. I just really ask myself the question obsessively. What can I do now to reach my dreams tomorrow and the day after, 1, 3, 5 years from now? What can I do today? And I think just constantly asking me that question led me down this road of using another method to figure out what's going on in a practice other than looking at the financials.
Because you were blocked. Your angst, this is another reason why we were our visions have aligned. Like you and I, as we've talked over the last 5 days since we've, that's as long as we've been talking about co-hosting this podcast, have realized that we share a lot of priorities and vision and direction that we want to go with this. And one of them is the fact that we were blocked from something that we want. So we found another way to get there. So for me, I can't own a practice till I get out of the Army. So I've got another 4 years ahead of me. And I love teaching. I love learning. I want to know and understand the business side of things. So that led me to doing this podcast. For you, you were blocked from getting financial information from acquisitions. So you said, how can I backwards engineer what an ideal practice would look like for me? And you figured it out.
Yeah. And I will say one thing. I wanted to add this so our viewers could kind of hear this. I messaged some dentists on Dentaltown that had sold their offices. And I asked them some advice from the seller's perspective, kind of what are you looking for? And one seller told me he sold his practice 2 years earlier than he was planning on doing it because he found the dentist that he felt was the right buyer. And so he thought, I'm never going to find another dentist that I feel is proper for my practice. So I'm going to sell it to this person a little earlier and I'm going to retire a couple years early and give that person my office because I feel like they're the right person. So I thought by contacting these people and showing, I do think I am the right buyer for an office because I think I understand priorities and I understand keeping the seller's goodwill. I'm paying them a premium price. I'm going to respect their patience. I understand what they're looking for. My mom's going through it almost. So
Yeah.
I can kind of get that. And I think I have an angle to play there that really resonates with people. And so I think I had a good shot of contacting them early and getting it. And so hopefully it works for me. It's kind of, you just kind of got to sit and wait for 10 months.
Yeah, no, I'm sure that's killing you. You'd want to be in escrow right now if you could choose.
I tried.
Yeah, I know. This is all just blowing me away. At speareducation.com, there's something called pathways. And what these are collections of courses that are grouped sequentially and by topic. And that kind of sounds like my podcast. So this resonates with me. If you're interested in implants, they have an implant pathway. Takes you all the way from single posterior implants to anterior, more complex cases, and even full mouth fixed cases. So here's Dr. Frank Spear talking about those tricky anterior ones.
What I'd like to talk to you about in this segment is something that actually took me over a couple of decades of trial and error experience to really come to understand, and that is implant position in the maxillary anterior or mandibular anterior for ideal aesthetics, but also ideal soft tissue stability long term. And try and keep the head of the fixture to the palate so that if we're putting it into an existing ridge, we leave at least 1.5 millimeters thickness of bone on the facial aspect of the head of the implant. Now, I'm not going to talk specifically about immediate implants in this segment. I will in other segments. But when we do an immediate implant, we actually have to recognize we're going to lose some of the buccal plate following the extraction. And so we even want the implant slightly farther to the palate.
To give yourself clear pathways to success in implant placement and restoration, as well as many, many other areas, go to speareducation.com and get an extended guest pass trial when you mention the Shared Practices podcast. Use the promo code LOW200 for $200 off your annual membership when you're ready to pull the trigger. So going back to this idea of a little bit of angst and a little bit of frustration and being held back, one of the things that's been really good about this podcast and really hard for me at the same time has been talking with all of these really successful, awesome people that are doing great things with their practices and have taken opportunities and created opportunities and like are crushing it just across the board, doing super well. And to not be able to apply any of this knowledge to like understand, okay, this is what a good practice looks like, and this is how we'd buy it, and this is what we'd turn around, and this is what we'd do next. Has that been frustrating for you, having seen some of our mutual friends go on and actually do all of this?
Absolutely. I started doing this my first year of dental school, and I think Derek was my only friend at the time that was a dental student going through the process, and he was a couple of years ahead of me. And now he's owned a practice for a year, and all of our other friends are owning practices, and I'm still in dental school. So yeah, that's definitely been, that has been to this point the hardest thing. And I got about a year and a couple weeks left, and hopefully it's going to fly by, and then I'll be excited to get out there, and I can't wait.
Well, I've got at least a year of pent up angst of like business knowledge and frustration out of you that if we continue to co-host and move forward with things, this will be our outlet between the podcast and courses and anything else we end up doing together. We'll put that angst to good use.
Absolutely, Richard. And I'm so excited about what you're doing with Shared Practices. When you told me what you were going to do and what you're planning on doing, it kind of made me really want to jump on board. So I'm excited to be here. And hopefully this works out and we're together for a long time co-hosting this podcast. Cool.
I'm way excited. Thank you for coming on and sharing your whole process here today. And we're gonna have a lot more good conversations. So welcome to the show, George Hariri, and very soon gonna be Dr. George Hariri. This is gonna be fun.
Thanks, Richard. I really appreciate it.
Awesome. We'll talk to you soon.